I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Coming up next on The Trade Guys, we're going to talk Tariff Man's nominations for key positions in the administration. We'll talk about export controls, and we'll end with one of our favorite topics, USMCA. All on the next episode of The Trade Guys. Trade Guys, we are back. It is Tariff Man's world, and it is becoming increasingly clear that Tariff Man is really excited to tariff. So, questions I have to start out with, let's talk about some of Tariff Man's nominees. Scott, I want to go right to you. You know, we've got a bunch of nominees here. We've got Scott Bessent, Jameson Greer, Russell Vought, Lighthizer in the mix somewhere here. Scott, what do we got?
Sure, that's a good place to start because there are some familiar faces that you'll remember from Tariff Man 1.0. The most immediate one is Kevin Hassett, who was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and will be brought back, I think, in either the Econ Advisors or Domestic Policy Council. I didn't quite get all the details. Kevin's a known entity, in my view, a very good guy, very good communicator about economic ideas, and tends to do it with a smile. So he's one of the more cheerful, happy warriors of this team. Jameson Greer will be the nominee U.S. Trade Representative, was Robert Lighthizer chief of staff at USTR. USTR is an unusual organization because it has 3 deputies. And the deputies have substantive responsibilities, like one is in Geneva, the other 2 split the issues and the world. They're kind of matrixed. But the chief of staff tends to function as a deputy secretary in terms of managing the operation. It's a very important job. He was trusted staff of Bob Lighthizer, and I would expect to see that kind of policy forward. But he's his own person. His law practice covered broader issues, the anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which was the core part of Lighthizer's practice before he became USTR. So we'll see. The other familiar face is Peter Navarro. Peter Navarro is likely to wind up as a executive branch advisor. He's back to work on trade and manufacturing. And he made a movie on China that is available on YouTube. I point that out because Bill has a cameo appearance.
How do we not know this?
Well, you know, this is a sore point because I do have a cameo appearance. They asked me for permission to use it. I said no, and they did it anyway.
Hey, Bill, you know what that is? That's show business.
That's exactly right.
I think it's some sort of IP violation. I thought at the time, you know, I assumed nobody was going to watch the movie, so it didn't matter. And I did get my comeuppance because one year my students used it in a video presentation to the class, which I think they thought was clever. I didn't.
Well, you can find it on YouTube, Andrew. So for no cost.
Audience out there, pay no attention to Scott. It's all gone.
You can have your laughs this weekend at Bill's expense.
We're about to get Peter Navarro a whole bunch of downloads here.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, cameo appearance by Trade Guy Bill. That is huge. And you know what? If I was your students at University of Maryland, I would have done the same thing.
I did not grade them down for it. And it was a time when I had more hair. So physical appearance is relevant. And mine was better then than it is now. So
yeah. And collectively, the 3 of us don't have much hair left. So, you know, that's how it goes.
It's a memorable moment, Bill. In any case, before we lose control entirely here, it's probably worth mentioning that there are 3 key roles that affect trade. One is the agriculture, which has a very important relationship to the U.S. trade policies. In this case, it's somebody who I'm not familiar with, Brooke Rollins. She was a member of the Texas Policy Council. She's been in sort of in conservative think tanks. She will be the nominee for Secretary of Agriculture. On Treasury, we have Scott Bessent, who's a private investor. We mentioned Lipnick of Cantor Fitzgerald last week. And Chris Wright, one of the more successful energy executives in American history, will be the energy secretary. So what I observed is you've got some familiarity on the trade team. You've got an economic team more broadly that is quite private sector oriented, successful executives who are going to be first and foremost focused on economic growth and making the U.S. a very attractive market for investors. Probably focus on tax policy more this coming year, 2025. But trade will never be far from the boss's heart, and we'll have plenty to work on even before the reassessment or renegotiation of USMCA.
We love trade as Tariff Man does. We really love it.
Yes. Bill, did I miss anything?
No, I was just going to say my general rule is, if it's somebody I know, it's a good appointment. And in this case, I don't know any of them, so I don't really have much to say about them. I would just say a couple of things. One, what everybody is going to be thinking about is, where are the sane people? Where is the leavening influence, the people that will come in and point out to Trump that he's about to do something that is really stupid or is going to produce consequences that are different from what he expects? And, the important thing about the list of people that Scott just went through is the one who's not there, and that's Bob Lighthizer. And we did a podcast where we said, so what about Bob? And it appears that, as the music looks like it's stopping, there may not be a chair for him. And I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but he brought something very important to the Trump 1.0, which was competence and attention to detail. One of the problems the previous Trump administration had was they didn't pay any attention to the proper process. In the United States, process is important. If you're going to change a rule, for example, you have to have a comment period. You have to solicit comments. There's all these steps you have to go through before you can make a change. And the Trump people lost in court a good bit because they didn't follow the rules. Bob was meticulous in following the rules and produced, I think, the trade successes that Trump had in agreements with USMCA, which was the big one, but also with Japan and Korea, because he knew how to negotiate. He knew how to use the process to get what he wanted. And in the case of USMCA, he knew how to deal with the Hill because he'd spent time there. And they're going to miss all that, and that makes me worried because you can expect the Secretary of the Treasury to be a calm voice because his portfolio is to worry about the market. And anything that's going to upset the markets, he's likely to step in and say, wait a minute, this is going to cause a market crisis. And that matters. I mean, Trump pays attention to that, and that'll be a powerful argument. I don't know that he has the personal relationship that is going to be decisive in that, but I guess we'll find out.
Well, let's talk about Bessent for a minute. He seems like an interesting guy for Treasury Secretary, but he also has a history of backing Democrats, including Al Gore, which is a bit surprising that President-elect Trump has nominated him, isn't it?
Well, it gives me some hope. I think the secret there is that for Trump, several things are important. Loyalty, and he likes rich people who he thinks have been successful.
Yeah.
And that kind of overrules other things. Plus, for Treasury, it was very clear he wanted a finance guy. I think that's why he didn't go with Lighthizer. Lighthizer a trade guy, as are we.
Right.
And we think that's the most important position in the government. However, if you're Trump, for Treasury, you want a finance guy, somebody who knows Wall Street, somebody who knows markets, and that Bessent meets that criteria. But I think it's a good sign that he's supported Democrats in the past. It shows he's not a locked-in ideologue. And, I just came from a lunch with some foreign government representatives that were there, and we had the same discussion. One of the other Americans made the point, this may be an interesting to watch this administration unfold, because in many ways, Trump is not entirely an ideologue either. He's a deal maker, and businessmen are expecting him to make deals. And the interesting question is going to be, what happens when he goes to China, meets Xi Jinping, and cuts a deal, and then comes back to Secretary of State Rubio and says, well, Marco, I cut this deal, and now she is my new best friend.
It's always possible. It's certainly one of the things about President-elect Trump, and you just have to read his book, The Art of the Deal, is one of the things he is actually very good at is making agreements that stick together. And that means everybody got something out of it.
Everyone gets to wet their beak.
That's exactly right. And there's a lot of that going on. That's what makes agreements in a very tough business like real estate hold together. But I think he has a long relationship with both Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick. They're all New Yorkers. They've all worked together for years. I think there's a great deal of trust that Trump has with both those two. As I read his comments that he made public on both individuals, he has a high level of trust for them. And I think it's good that they've been associated with Democratic candidates in the past. That's not unlike Trump himself.
Well, that's true. And I think we should all feel good, no matter what our politics are, that both Lutnick and Bessent are people who are qualified for these positions.
Yeah, they're both very successful. They both understand markets. They understand the fundamentals of U.S. economic success. I think they do a fine job.
You made a good point before, Scott, that during the first Trump administration in 2016, he made it a point to how the stock market was constantly rising. And that's something I think we can expect here again, him to follow the markets very closely and him to remind Americans that their 401ks are going up. Bill?
Nothing further on that. I think there's going to be more internal division than you think. I think Navarro's history in Trump 1.0 was to present the president with a bunch of wacko ideas, and then other people had to spend time knocking them down. One of the stories, maybe apocryphal, was that one of the reasons that Lighthizer didn't travel very much is because he was afraid that if he left the country, Navarro would get the president's ear on some strange proposal and he'd come back and once again have to show up with the dustpan and broom to clean up the mess. And this time, there may not be anybody there with the dustpan and the broom. There'll just be the mess.
All right, guys, thank you for that insight. Let's shift to semiconductor export controls. There's a whole new wave of BIS announcements. What about it?
Like everything with export controls, it's complicated. I'm not going to go through the whole rule, although I want to tell people a little bit about what's in it. But
you'll spare us from the whole rule.
I will attempt to spare it, yes.
Because if you don't, Scott and I are going to start talking about Michigan, Ohio State very quickly.
Well, Scott told me beforehand that he doesn't want to do that. So it may be a one-ended conversation.
He and members of my family are in mourning. I'm still in shock from the Ravens losing to the Eagles, but that's a whole other matter. But anyway, Bill, I digress.
I watched that game in your honor or memory, as the case may be, the Ravens game. Anyway, the thing to remember is what the government is trying to do is primarily to hold China's progress on AI back, and both AI with military applications, but that spills over into civilian applications as well. And they're trying to do that by controlling the hardware, the software, and the tools that make the hardware more effectively. And so they've added controls on 24 additional types of semiconductor manufacturing equipment that's needed to produce the advanced node integrated circuits that are used for AI learning. That includes etch, deposition, lithography, a whole bunch of things like that. They've added controls on 3 new types of software tools that are used for developing those circuits. They've done 2 main things also that I think stand out. The first thing they did is they closed a loophole that controlled the export of semiconductor manufacturing tools from the United States if they had certain levels of capability, but appeared not to control the same items going from the same companies manufacturing them in third countries, Singapore and several other countries where that actually was happening. They plugged that hole and are now treating those exports the same. The other thing they've done that's new, that's important, is they realized that another way to get at this problem is by looking at memory and memory chips. The first 2 rules in 2022 and 2023 focused basically on processing speed and related functions like that. But they've now come to understand that an integral part of AI has to be memory, because AI learning depends upon processing and going through massive amounts of data. All that data has to be stored somewhere. And if you can't store it somewhere, or if you can't get it to the processing chips fast enough, it's like a choke point. You slow down the ability of the machines to do what you want them to do. So the government's placed controls on high bandwidth memory because it's critical to AI training. And that's a new development. They haven't dealt with memory before. We'll see how that plays out. That's going to affect several companies, including Samsung and SK Hynix, and in the United States, Micron. We'll see what they have to say about it. They've added a bunch of entities to the entity list, 140, which has been controversial, not because of the 140, because there were people that said they should have added more. And they left off the list a number of companies that do business with Huawei, or in the judgment of third parties, do business with Huawei, or are otherwise engaged in the production of chips of various sorts that are relevant to AI. So not everybody got on the list is the short answer to that. And BIS has no explanation yet on why they left some people off, but that's been one of the criticisms. Finally, they've added some additional foreign direct product rules, and I won't go into the details except to say that they're in the process of adopting an old concept that the State Department used for weapons, which is known as a see-through rule. And Commerce didn't used to have a see-through rule in the sense that Commerce would look at the item being exported. So if you're exporting a laptop, it's a laptop. And they look at where was the laptop made, who's making the laptop, what's the content of the laptop, where is it going? They didn't attempt to see through the laptop and look at whether the chips inside the laptop were Chinese or not. Now they're using the rules to get at that kind of situation. So if an item contains a Chinese chip now, even though the item itself is 98% not Chinese, even if it contains a Chinese chip, not all items, just the ones that are relevant to this universe of AI technologies, then it's going to come under controls as well. So that may end up being a rather significant expansion of what they've been doing. The final thing they've done is to further implement something that they started before, which is to figure out how do we multilateralize this? Because it's obvious that if we're the only people that do this, and the Dutch when it comes to tools, or the Japanese when it comes to tools and chips, or the Taiwanese and Koreans when it comes to chips, if they backfill and just fill in the gaps that the Americans can no longer supply, we've accomplished nothing. One of the reasons this rule took so long was because they had extensive negotiations with Japan and the Netherlands about it. And what they are trying to do now is they've exempted some items that are made in either the Netherlands or Japan, not in third countries by the same companies, but in the Netherlands and Japan, because those two countries have adopted controls that are similar to ours. And what the government is trying to do is to create a network of other countries that are doing the same thing, that is adopting our kinds of controls on these items. And the reward, if you do that, is that we exempt those countries' end users from the same controls. So that's continued to be expanded in this rule. And if anybody's still awake out there, I'll stop.
Everybody's awake. Scott, your turn.
Well, I just wanted to point out that, as always, in the U.S.-China controversy, the Chinese Act, they have put in place countermeasures, which ought to be a wake-up call for the U.S., in my view. The countermeasures are the restriction of exports of critical minerals, in this case, graphite, gallium, germanium, antimony, all essential materials. And what China knows, and listeners should know, is that the United States has basically outsourced the dirty work when it comes to mining and processing to other countries like China. And we don't do it ourselves, despite the fact that we could. This is the measure that China has chosen to take. We're vulnerable. And if you really want to be a geopolitical thinker and try to find a success here, we probably ought to deal with the fact that we are weak here. And the first thing we have to do is acknowledge that we have a problem. We have about the same share of the Earth's crust as China does. They do all the mining, and particularly on things like graphite that are really messy to process. They handle all that for us. Thank you very much. But we have plenty of graphite in the United States. In fact, one of the oldest government agencies, the U.S. Geological Survey, can tell you exactly where it is. All right? We also have commercialized this technology before. If we wanted to get serious, we wouldn't have to invent anything. Commercial scale production of minerals and refined minerals has been going on for as long as the Industrial Revolution, basically. We know how to do this. We just don't do it. So we could change that anytime we decided to. So I think that's where the seriousness comes in. And if these are strategic minerals, let's get serious about what it really takes to permit them, what the technology is needed to do it, and where they are, and address the vulnerability. Otherwise, we're an easy and obvious target.
So I have a question, a very important question here. Is it pronounced antimony or antimony?
I can tell you what my chemistry prof called it, antimony.
Good to know.
But that's, one prof. I thought he was fabulous, and I learned a lot from him, including how to pronounce that particular earth.
All right, we can go with antimony. Guys, we got a couple minutes left. Let's shift to one of our favorite topics. Of course, it's USMCA, tariffs on Canada and Mexico. I just want to open this with a question. So if Tariff Man wants to slap tariffs on Canada, our friendly friends to the north, and Justin Trudeau just went down to Palm Beach to press the flesh. Let's say he goes forward with these tariffs with Canada and our aluminum prices are skyrocketing. How is any politician going to explain to Joe Sixpack that their six-pack has just doubled in price because we're messing around with Canada?
Well, that's a very good question that you should pose directly to Trump, because that's what's going to happen.
I believe that's what I just did in this podcast, because we're really hoping Tariff Man and his people listen.
Well, I hope so, too. Some probably do. I doubt that he does, but it's not just beer cans. I remember when Trump made this threat in Trump 1.0, one of his supporters, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, famously said he was against anything that raised the price of tequila and guacamole.
Yeah.
And they would be on the list too. The other thing that would be on the list, which is a little bit of a surprise given Trump's frequent statements about the high cost of energy, is oil and gas. Despite the fact that we're a net exporter, we import a lot of oil and gas from both Canada and Mexico. The Mexican oil, which is a type that is refinable in American refineries, I think a lot of it ends up as gasoline. So the guy who says he wants to reduce gas prices at the pump is about to make them more expensive. And he's about to make your beer more expensive, not to mention your guacamole and your tequila. So what that means to me is this is in the threat category, not in the reality category.
I see.
I think Bill's exactly right. And this is basically a choice of how to apply economic pressure. The president-elect wants some things done when it comes to migration and drugs for the two economies where we have very long borders. All right. And so the issues are known. The requests are quite specific. They have nothing to do with commercial issues, to the best of my knowledge. This is maximum pressure. All right. In this circumstance, tariffs are really no different than, say, using economic sanctions or financial sanctions.
So you're saying this is his leverage. This is art of the deal stuff.
I think so. And I think that's the way it's been received by both Canada and Mexico. This isn't an issue of unfair trade. This is an issue of we want some things addressed that are related to the long borders, border management on migration and drugs. You have the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, basically saying, hey, forget Mexico. We got to cut our own deal.
Well, and nobody's blowing the president-elect off here. I mean, President Sheinbaum of Mexico jumped right into it. Trudeau, of course, as we know, was in the dining room at Mar-a-Lago. They're taking him very seriously, as they should.
And I think they're going to find an accommodation here, in which case the tariffs win. But more importantly, we are so in the habit of using one kind of economic pressure, and that is financial sanctions, okay, that we've lost sight over the harm that financial sanctions do because they make people use other things than the dollar and the U.S. banking system to settle transactions, which is not good in the long run. And we have 17,000 sanctioned entities out there with financial sanctions. I can't think of a one that's worked. Whose behavior have we changed with financial sanctions? Not Russia, not Venezuela. So the thing is, I think we need to look at this differently, that he's decided not to use the kind of sanctions everybody else does. He's got another way to apply pressure, and it looked like it worked, at least in its first appearance.
Haven't changed Russia or Iran's behavior, that's for sure.
Yes.
No.
The great-grandfather of all these sanctions is Cuba, which goes back to the 60s. And until he died, Castro was still there. And his successors are still doing the same thing.
Yet never affected Castro. In fact, he blamed every economic problem the Cubans had on the American sanctions for 50, 60 years.
It was one of the biggest policy mistakes we made. And some of these other things, it's a frustrating issue to deal with. I used to have to deal with it a lot when I was at the National Foreign Trade Council, because you go up to Congress and explain how these things were not going to work. And they would say, well, we have to do something. And I would say, well, you don't have to do something stupid. Why don't you think about doing something smart? And the answer is something smart is hard to find. You know, sanctions are the only tool between diplomacy, talking, and war. And nobody wants war, and talking doesn't do much work. So the theory is, well, maybe sanctions will. I think what we're seeing is that they don't have the effect that's intended. And they do cause collateral damage, which is another issue. I had members at the NFTC who, it was ironic. I mean, they had permission from the United States government to export to Iran because the nature of their product fell under the humanitarian category. And they had licenses, you know, from the Treasury Department to do that. And they could go to banks and show them. It did no good. They could not find financing for their exports.
Right, because the financial sanctions took the entire, any transaction.
You know, the banks would say on Iran, it's not that much money. It's too much work to try to differentiate between the good exports and the sanctioned exports, so we just won't finance any of them.
So maybe a rethink on tariffs wouldn't be a bad idea.
Well, and if anybody's interested in a really, really perceptive book about sanctions, read our dear friend and colleague Juan Zarati's book, Treasury's War.
Yes.
It's a great read. Juan, of course, was Deputy National Security Advisor in the Bush administration and a practitioner of sanctions. Great, great book.
That's where it all started. And Juan's a wonderful colleague and really draws some insights from being present at the creation of all this.
Absolutely.
The final comment on the Mexican-Canadian thing is, in a way, the only thing he's going to accomplish by this is speeding up the inevitable. Under the USMCA agreement, a review, which is sort of a code for renegotiation, is mandatory in 2026. And it doesn't matter what Sheinbaum or Trudeau, if they want to do it or not, it's going to happen in 2026. What Trump has done is maybe he's moved it up to 2025.
My sense is he's in a hurry. He wants to move fast and break things.
Yes.
Just like the tech guys talk about.
He wants a victory, and I think he views USMCA as a victory. Why not go in and do it at Act 2? Do it again.
Well, we wish him well. Gentlemen, it's always great to spend time with you, and we will be back, I believe, next week. Same trade time, same trade channel.
Thanks.
Indeed. Thank you.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.